Hey everyone, it is Wednesday, April 6th, 2011, and this is episode 8A of the GameDevNewbie podcast. It is one of the mini podcasts I'll do on the days that I'm working on my game. And I know I haven't been around for a few days, mostly because I was exhausted from the day job, and I just couldn't get the mental energy together to work on a project. So my advice is, if you're young and can do it without a job, because it's easier. If you got to go to work every day, you're too tired to actually do what you love afterwards. At least some of the time. Anyway, all I'm saying is put all your effort into what you want to do, not into something you don't want to do. And then what you want to do doesn't get done. Anyway, that's my advice. Fix my hair, take a chug of water, watch the camera try to focus on me. Alright, so today, what did I do today? Today I did something for a few hours, which is a pretty interesting change to the way things were working before in the game. Previously, when the wow, this thing really wants to focus all the time. I think the desk is moving too much. Alright, so before, the way the enemies and the players would initiate melee combat is they just run into each other. So on collision, enter, damage would be applied to both the enemy and the player. And that's not really great for a game that wants to have some kind of melee combat. In a game where you're just firing at random enemies everywhere and you just want to avoid the enemies, that's fine. But if you want to be able to have two types of combat, ranged and melee combat, you don't want a point of health taken off every time. You want there to be some kind of skill check or check to see that a hit has actually happened. So what happens is the player will have to press the melee button. If it's the mouse, which is all I really have implemented right now, if it's the mouse, it would be the right button, the right mouse button. So the player would come up, make contact with the enemy, and have to hit the right mouse button in order to fire or swing his sword. Same thing with the enemy. If the enemy comes in contact, it will fire off a melee round and hopefully hit the player and then subtract a point of health. Sometimes they don't always hit, so that's actually good. It's a weird... I think what I did was I put some randomness into the direction in which they fire, so sometimes they can actually fire in the wrong direction, or not quite at the player. So let's just take a quick look at what I've got going, and then we'll look at some of the code. Alright, so here we are. We'll hit play, and we'll try not to destroy any right away so you can see what goes on. Alright, so there's some enemies. That one fires range bullets, but these guys here, they are melee guys. So they only really fire when you come in contact with them. So let's go up here to this guy here and we'll touch him. See, now he fires. I don't have the firing range set. Like the melee, the player's melee combat only fires real short distance. But the enemies, they can fire pretty far. Alright, so we want to be able to hit the enemies and then hit the right button and then destroy the enemies at the right button. Also, the melee attack does 5 points of damage, whereas the range attack only does 1. So you can see the enemies firing only when we're in range. So if we go there, see he fires. Now he's not firing. And one problem I was having is that the enemies are firing whenever they touched each other. It took me a few minutes to figure that out, but they are not doing that anymore. So you'll see some enemies touch, and they won't, just because they're colliding, they don't necessarily fire a melee round off at the player. So that's basically what it is. Oh, and you also notice that when I collide, I don't lose health. Only if they actually hit me with a melee round. So if we can get one to hit me with the melee rounds. They don't always hit, which I guess is good, but we'll have to do some, maybe for the melee rounds, we'll have to improve their accuracy or something. Come on, hit me, guys. I guess I got 2 health points left. They must have been hitting me sometime. I gotta turn off these ranged guys so I can just make sure that the melee hits are actually hitting. There we go. There's a couple melee hits. Alright. So that's that. Now how did I do that? Let's just check the time. About 5 minutes. We had about 10 minutes left. Alright, so previous version had an on collision enter method that pretty much just said if the game object.tag is not equal to other game object.tag, in other words, as long as the tags weren't the same, then we're just going to calculate damage. And that's all the original version said. I added all this extra conditions and code. One thing I added is this variable called combat state. And combat state is actually on the object variable script. You can see it here. Actually, I don't know if you can see it here. Okay, you can see it here. Combat state. It's by default it's false. And what happens is, if we go to the weapon controller, let me zoom in so you can actually see what I'm showing you. When the player or an enemy object collides with the player, if a player collides with the enemy and vice versa, that's what this here says. This if statement says when the game object.tag is equal to player and the other game object.tag is equal to enemy. So in other words, when the game object colliding is the player, a collision between a player and an enemy, or the game object is equal to enemy and the other game object is equal to player. So when the player collides with the enemy and when the enemy collides with the player, we want to change the combat state. Now, why do I do it for both with this OR statement here? Well, this code, the weapon controller code or script, is actually used by both the player object and the enemy objects. So this code here will work for both the players and the enemies. So that's why we need to know if the game object tag and the other game object tag are equal to player or enemy. Hope that makes sense. Anyway, so what do I mean by changing the state? Well, I have that variable in object variables called combat state, and what it says is if the player or the enemy objects are in combat. Are they in combat? And if they are, it will let them fire the weapons, or the melee weapons. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm toggling that state. And I'm toggling that state and by calling this method here called toggle combat state and assigning it back to combat state. Or assigning the return value back to combat state. If you take a look at this method, toggle combat state, I send to it the current combat state. Alright, so let's actually scroll down to that method. I think it's at the bottom here. Alright, so here's the method definition. Alright, so it's a boolean, and returns a boolean, true or false, toggle combat state, and it accepts the boolean, the current state. So the current state is what we passed to it, which was the combat state. And then we take the current state and we assign to it the negative of the current state. And that's what this not symbol here. So take the current state and make it equal to not the current state. So if current state is true, then that means the opposite, or the not current state, is false. And then we return the current state again. Very simple. So it basically just toggles the combat state to true and false. So if it's true, it turns it to false. If it's false, it turns it to true. Alright. So that's great. Now, on collision, we will set this combat state. Except, however, if it's a projectile colliding with the player or enemy. In that case, we just want to assign damage, because the projectiles also use the weapon controller script to do their damage. And you can see here, it calls the method calculate damage, which I probably described at some other point a long time ago. So we won't worry about the projectiles. Just know that they don't have states. They don't. Well, they do, but they don't. They don't need them, so we don't need to toggle it. You just need to toggle it for players and enemies. All right, and then I'll show you what actually how this toggle works in a sec. I'm running out of time. I got 5 more minutes, so less than 5 minutes. All right. So here's the next statement: on collision exit. And what I'm doing is I'm finding out if it's the same thing. If the player and the enemy are no longer colliding with each other, then we want to change the state again. So if it was combat state was true, it's now going to be false. So that once the players are no longer colliding with each other, they no longer can initiate melee combat. Now, it doesn't make logical sense that combat state would be true and false. Well, that's not a state. It's just a Boolean. I guess I could change the name of this to melee combat state, true or false, to make it more descriptive. But right now it just says combat state. Alright, so one last thing. We want to go to the non-player or player controller input. No, non-player controller input, because that's the only place this really matters. Take a look at where was it? I think it's right here. You know, the firing controls fires off the process AI firing. And what it asks here is, hey, if the enemy object has a firing behavior, or it's in the combat state, or if combat state is true, in other words, if it's in melee combat state, don't worry about this here, then we want to fire. We want to call the firing behavior method. The firing behavior method does 2 things, or it does one of 2 things. It does 3 things actually, but one of 2 and 1 thing definitely. It gets an object vector, which I've probably described before. And that just sends the projectile in the direction of the player. But the important part for this particular day was this here. And basically this asks, hey, if the combat state is true, in other words, if melee combat state is true, then what we're going to do is we're going to use the melee weapon stats to control the projectile firing. And I say projectile even though it's a melee combat because I'm using projectiles to stand in for a swinging sword. But all I really need to know is if they come in contact and a hit is landed. So we're just going to use melee weapon rate, melee weapon range, and melee weapon damage. We're going to pass that on to process projectile. The projectile will cause all these other things to happen, and melee will be resolved. However, if it's not combat state, if combat state is false, but we have the firing behavior, we're going to fire off the projectile as we did in the past, using the ranged weapon rate, ranged weapon range, and ranged weapon damage. Actually, some of this is a little bit different than the last time I might have showed people on a podcast because I changed some stuff last week and I didn't do a podcast about it. But that's for another day. I'll recap that at the end of the week. So that's what I was able to do today. And, whoa, and it works. Alright, unlike my scrolling around my, what the hell do they call that? Windows, Entourage, or something, I don't know, something like that. Alright. So that's what I was able to do today. Took me about 2 hours. Not too much time. I got a late start today, so got a couple seconds. Reminder, this upcoming weekend is 8 Static in Philly at Club something or Studio something, Studio 32 or something. You can look it up on the 8 Static website, 8static.com or .net or something. Something like that. I'm gonna go. Okay, that's it. Got no more time. Peace out. Thanks for watching.